Hey everybody, it's Aunt Bibi. Today is Tuesday, November 10th, 2020. I'm Barb Hammer. So once again today I want to talk about the presidential election. And I want to talk about how you're not hearing about the real scandal about elections in the US. So you have a lot of Trump supporters upset about Joe Biden being called the winner. That was called on Saturday the 7th. And ever since then, there's been uproar about, voter fraud and mail in ballots being postmarked the day after the election. Oh my God. Ballots that were probably put in the mailbox late at night on the 3rd, election day. But oh my God, we can't allow these votes. And then they claim that Trump ballots were burned or dumped in landfills, and there are all these fake videos. And yeah, there's the whistleblower, the whistleblower. Whenever I hear the word whistleblower, I know it's not a whistleblower. It's an agenda they want to push anyway. So yeah, the taboo subjects are electronic voting fraud, and the real thing you never hear about is exit polling that shows the election fraud. And another thing that's not talked about enough is voter suppression. So both sides, let's just get this off the table. Both sides will commit election fraud, and both sides will commit voter suppression, um, but both sides they won't talk about exit polling. Uh, so exit polling. I remember back in 2000. So Al Gore was declared the winner in the Florida election in 2000 against George W. Bush, and that was based upon exit polling. Yes, exit polling was used routinely in the media to forecast the winner in elections. Very important. And another scandal in that election was all the voter suppression in Florida, and that came out. And there was a recount started, and then I guess the Bush team they said stop the recount, and in the end, it was the Supreme Court, a very biased Supreme Court, that decided in favor of George W. Bush. But because Florida was called based on exit polling for Al Gore, he should have been the winner, and he did not contest it. And that's the thing. You're not supposed to, it's taboo to talk about election fraud. It's taboo to cite the exit polls as evidence that the official vote count is not correct. Okay, and then I'm familiar with 2016. Personally, I was really heavily involved in that election that year. And so there was massive election fraud in the Democratic primaries. So Democrats, and they were committing voter suppression too. And I experienced that as an expat living outside of the US. I voted as an expat, and they knew that expats were big supporters of Bernie Sanders, and that was being suppressed. Um, and I had a hard time getting a ballot. I was very persistent. I started early, and had never experienced that kind of. I could tell they were trying to discourage me from voting and making very lame excuses. They even made me re-register to vote. Yes, indeed they did. They claimed they had mailed me a ballot in the snail mail. Didn't get it, and I persisted, and they emailed me a ballot I had to print out and then mail in. Yeah. So back in 2016, I became familiar with a number of figures who were talking about all this. So number one was Debbie Lusignan, same progressive, and she has disappeared from social media. She disappeared in 2018 after kind of going off talking about mass shootings and incorrectly saying that there were no casualties. No one was killed or injured, wounded in Las Vegas, and that wasn't true. And she became very abusive to her audience, including me. And so she had some issues. So she decided just to get out. It was too this. I guess the stress was getting to her, so she got out of social media. And There are still some videos of her floating around. So she was talking a lot about the fraud in the Democratic primaries, election fraud, and voter suppression. And unfortunately, she got involved in the recount that Dr. Jill Stein, the Green candidate, organized just to do a recount in the states where Donald Trump had won. And Podesta lawyers, Clinton Podesta lawyers, were involved in that. So that was disgraceful. So that recount, um, that was a problem. Now, I didn't vote for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. I voted for Stein. I wish I hadn't voted at all in the general election. I wish I hadn't gotten involved in that, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot. Other people, figures that I became familiar with are these three: Lori Grace, Bob Fitrakis, and Cliff Arnebeck. So, Lori Grace, I haven't seen or heard anything from her. Bob Fitrakis is a lawyer and a journalist, and apparently he has gone off and he's gotten involved in the uh, Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Um, because well, he lives in Ohio, and the Epstein was connected to an Ohio billionaire, Les Wexner, and then on. So that's Lori Grace, and this is Bob Fitrakis, and this is Cliff Arnebeck, another lawyer from Ohio, and he was involved in exposing. I think he and Fitrakis were both involved in exposing the 2004 election in Ohio, and how Ohio, Karl Rove was involved. Karl Rove liked to fix the Ohio vote, was a very key state um, in elections. So Karl Rove had fixed it um, for George W. Bush and Dick Cheney against John Kerry and John Edwards. And so John Kerry and John Edwards should have won that election, but because of Ohio and the fix, um, it went to George W. Bush, and Dick Cheney got a second term. So Cliff Arnebeck was involved in taking a deposition in Washington, D.C. with Michael Connell, I believe, who was a Bush operative, and he had been involved in making the fix happen. So in the electronic voting. So, and then suspiciously, Mike Connell, after giving that deposition in Washington, D.C., flew back to Ohio, his home there, and he died in a very suspicious private airplane crash. Cliff Arnebeck has mentioned that there have been other witnesses, clients he's dealt with who have received serious threats, and he says a couple of them have been assassinated. I wouldn't be surprised. Karl Rove is a very shady character. Karl Rove, he was George W. Bush's political strategist, a dirty trickster, and very, very dirty. So, people were dying over election fraud. And Karl Rove, interesting. I read that he was involved in fixing the Democratic primaries for Hillary. So, Democrat and Republican, it's a single business party, so they fix it for whatever reason, for whoever they want. I know they definitely did not want Bernie Sanders. He had a huge populist movement behind him. People on the left, right, the center, evangelical Christians. Bernie would have easily won. Bernie won the Democratic primaries. Bernie would have easily beaten Trump in the general election. So interesting that Karl Rove was involved in that, fixing things for Hillary. And I think he's been telling people to be quiet about the election this time, between Trump and Joe Biden. So isn't that interesting? Joe Biden, so Karl Rove, I've read, I think, be quiet, don't say anything. Okay. Anyway, so those three I was familiar. Another figure I'm familiar with, I became familiar with, whoops, I don't, yeah, Steven Spinwell. Hang on. There were videos I had up here. Hang on. For some reason they're gone. So Stephen Spoonamore, he's featured in another number of videos. And I had this up here, sorry. Yeah, so here. Oh no, they're there. Okay, I found the page. It's right there. Sorry. I had it there. I didn't see it. Okay, so Stephen Spoonamore, so he was an expert in banking, securing banking systems, I believe. That's his background. And he was talking about the man in the middle and how they can hack elections. And Scott, on his Church Dog 42 channel, has talked about him. He's talked about that, how they do it. And there's a video of how to hack elections. So he's got a board here. He explains it. Yeah, Stephen Spoonamore. And Stephen Spoonamore was mentioned in a video with Lori Grace, Bob Fitrakis, and Cliff Arnebeck. And I mentioned that in another video. I'll give you all the links. It's very interesting. So they went through, this is a long video, and went through like a lot of the background information about election fraud and Michael Connell dying in that plane crash suspiciously, and the fraud in the Democratic primaries. So a very good video. So this is the Trust Vote TV channel that was providing a lot of videos about election fraud back in 2016. And so you'll see, oh, there's Jared Beck, the DNC class action lawsuit, and there's Debbie, and there are others who talked about it. So, people were talking. And this year they're talking about the mail-in ballot. Problem with the mail-in ballot is it's a bubble sheet, and so they're optically scanned. And those votes can be flipped too. It's not just the touch screen. So I talked to my cousin who lives in my home state of Virginia, and I didn't vote this year. I haven't voted since 2016. So he said he was kind of thrown. They didn't have touch screens. They had the bubble sheets that had to be optically scanned. And another interesting thing is he was getting a lot of phone calls. They were really trying to get the vote out. And I seem to recall that when there's a big turnout, the Democrat usually wins. That's what I recall. So there was a big effort, at least in that area, to get the vote out. And I think there was a big push to get the vote out. And so he said he was getting a lot of calls. He even got calls election day. And once he actually went to vote, the call stopped. So they knew he had voted. And he's also said, my cousin said, that in 2016 he did not vote in the general election. So he had voted in the primary for Bernie. And the general, he just didn't see a point to voting. So he didn't. And he said that he was getting a lot of harassing phone calls afterward. Or contact, I don't know if it's phone calls, email, or it might have been a mix of things, letters, I don't know. So he did not want to that was interesting. The reason he decided to vote is he didn't want to get harassed. So he voted down ballot Democrat. And he wasn't going to vote in the presidential election because, he had no use for Joe Biden. He said, it's interesting, he said he would have voted for Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, but definitely not Joe Biden, and he didn't like Trump either. So he wasn't going to vote in the presidential election, but he said that in the end he did. And there was only one third-party candidate on the ballot. That surprised me. There's usually, at least a couple, but no green. So he voted Libertarian. He knew it didn't matter, but he just was not going to vote for Joe Biden for sure. And he didn't like Trump, so. Anyway, so Debbie Lesignan, Lori Grace, Bob Fitrakis, Cliff Harnebeck, and Stephen Spoonamore. So those are the figures. You don't really hear too much. You're not really hearing anything from them, really. So I looked up Spoonamore, and I found this was interesting. So he is talking about the election, and so there was this Twitter post, why is the GOP accepting the results of congressional and Senate races, but is refuting the results of the presidential race? Weren't they on the same ballots? And somebody said, does seem a bit odd, no? And so Stephen Spoonamore, this is his account, they didn't hack the presidential enough. Missed the target. They got the hack right for the Senate. Interesting. That's what so he hasn't really, he insists on paper ballots. So a couple of weeks ago, I voted in a British Columbia provincial election, and we have paper. And so Canadian federal elections, provincial elections, it's paper ballot, pencils, and it's not plexiglass. They're just cheap cardboard boxes, but it's all. There are people from the individual parties watching the vote, and they watch the count, and it's all very clean. And the advanced polling was very accurate in the final results. There was a few close elections, and but it's a very clean election anyway, in contrast to the U.S. elections. So I want to really talk about the exit polling. So that's the thing you really don't hear about, but the fact that the Trump supporters are distracting from electronic voting fraud, and they're talking about mail-in ballots and paper ballots, these paper ballots and all these mail-in ballots, and um, Trump ballots being burned or dumped. Yeah. So, and they talk about voter fraud. So people, yeah, people, dead people are voting, and people who aren't citizens are voting. And no, that's not how voting, that's not election fraud happens. It's just so electronically so easy. And over the years, I'm sure it's so much easier now than it used to be. And they can fractionalize votes. They can take a vote for a candidate and then just take part of that and give it to another candidate and leave the other candidate with just a little bit or something. They can break up one vote. They can actually do it. It's that sophisticated. So you can imagine the technology, no problem now. So this is the only source where I found the actual exit polling per state. So the exit polling that's reported in mainstream media, it's just bullshit. So it doesn't tell you who people have voted in a state for each candidate. It tells you like how black males voted, how white women voted, um, what the issues were. It just talks about the demographics and the issues, and it doesn't tell you anything. They're not reporting. So Edison Research gathers this information. And my cousin actually told me something interesting. He remembered back in 2016, he got a call from Edison Research. So they apparently do some opinion polling before elections. Yeah. So he told me that. I did not know that. So Edison Research does a lot of polling. So anyway, this is so on this site, TDMS Research. So this is Theodore de Macedo Suarez. He gathers this information, and he draws up the tables of the exit polls. And he did that for some of the Democratic primaries, but unfortunately, he didn't release the information until well after the primaries, so he didn't know for a while. And anyway, unfortunately, and I think he did that. I think he was a Biden supporter, to tell you the truth. So, everybody has a bias. Um, but anyway, so this is the third table he's drawn up. So he drew up this one after they called Joe Biden as the winner. And it says, according to the exit polls conducted by Edison Research, Biden easily won the presidency. Okay. And the exit polls were conducted in 24 states. In 22 states, the discrepancies between the exit polls and the vote count favored Trump. As the table below shows, in 12 of these states, the discrepancies favoring Trump exceed the margin of error of the state's exit poll. Mm-hmm. So that means election fraud. Yeah. Okay. Okay, the exit polls conducted by Edison in this coronavirus pandemic year used the same methodology as in previous years. In 2016, absentee and early voting represented about 40% of the vote. 40% of the votes. This year, it will exceed 60%. Early voters were submitted the exit poll questionnaire at their voting locations, same as on election day. Now, telephone interview, eh, telephone interviews were conducted of absentee voters as in previous years. So that's how they do it. People have wondered how they do this with, so they know who's likely to vote, who's registered to vote, and they see the voting patterns. If these are consistent voters, and then they find them. Um, the possibility that our vote counts are corrupt cannot be dismissed offhand or ignored. Computer vote counts are never verified by full hand counts, and the vote counting software is proprietary, hidden from view, and inaccessible to the public. Election results in the United States are determined by vote counting systems supplied by 3 private corporations. This is big business. Yeah. Election Systems and Software LLC, Dominion Voting, and Hart Intercivics. According to the Pew Research Center, 94% of all voters in 2016 voted on electronic voting machines or optically scanned ballots nationwide. So those are the bubble sheets. So members of Congress observe the fact that their proprietary software, inaccessible to elections officials and the public, undermine trust in our elections. No kidding. The possible means to corrupt the vote is not hard, as every vote counting machine has the vendor's software custom updated for each state prior to every election. The votes can be corrupted by hacking / altering this software at the source, and either the vendor or state functionaries will install this software in all the state's machines. So again, this mentions, the U.S. is one of the few major democracies in the world that continue this computerized vote counting. And, Canada is one of the Western countries that paper, pencil, and it's all verified. Okay. So there's some interesting article links here too in this website. It has a CNN website's poll, exit polling information, but when you click on these, it doesn't, it's the demographics. It's the stupid demographic. There is a CNN article about how they conduct the exit polling. So that's interesting. And yeah. So they talk about, CNN will talk about the exit polling, but they won't give you the actual information. No. So mainstream media, they used to report this. They stopped. So the mainstream media, I think they pay Edison Research to conduct this polling. So back in 2016, there were exit polls for the Democratic primaries, and because people caught on to the fraud, then the exit polling was called off for the last primaries, including the big one in California. Yeah, so people caught on, and anyway, so there's another fellow, Richard Charnon. He has a blog, and I mentioned him in the previous video. I looked at his blog, and he used to talk about exit polling and something. Okay, yeah, this is another thing. So Richard Charnon, so he's a statistician, mathematician, and he worked on Wall Street. He's worked on Wall Street, and what's weird is that I believe he used to talk about exit polling. He doesn't anymore. And he was forecasting Trump to win. And it's very strange. His reasoning didn't make any sense. He claims that Trump won, but he bases it on how people vote in elections every year, and he seems to think that people, what's strange, the problem with Richard Chernin seems to be that he thinks people are going to be consistently voting Democratic or Republican all the time. And I don't think that's the case. And I don't think takes into consideration people will vote down ballot differently than for presidential. And my cousin's a perfect example of that. So, um, yeah, Richard Chernin, I don't think he used to have a good reputation, but I think he's lost it. And the fact that he doesn't talk about exit polling, the taboo subject, leads me to believe that something's happened with him. Um, yeah, something very strange there with Richard Turner. Anyway, so I want to just look at this chart. So when I was looking at this, so the Trump supporters. So as I said, there's election fraud on both sides. Um, and yeah, you can see this on the chart. I laughed at California. So California is down here on the bottom. And so the exit polling shows Biden won 61.5% and Trump way behind 36.5%. And then the official, but what's funny, the official result vote count, they had to pad the numbers for Biden. That wasn't good enough. I laughed at this. This is just ridiculous. So 65, a little over 65%. So they added, almost 4% to Biden's official count. And then they took away a few from Trump. And so that is obviously outside of the margin of error. So it's, the discrepancy of 3%. Another state, um, the thing that's really shocking is they called Iowa for Trump, but clearly there's a problem there with that call. So Biden in the exit polling, 49, just a little 49.2%, and Trump 48.3%. So that's pretty close. But look at this. They really flipped it hard for Trump. So they took away they took away over 4% from Biden, and they added like 5%. Yeah, so they flipped that. And that is that is a huge percentage outside of the margin of error. 5.4%. So Iowa should never have been called for Trump. I mean, that it was close, but it should not have been called for Trump. And that is really a glaring example of fraud there. Now, they have down here, I'm just looking at the highlighted here. So, North Carolina, I don't know if North Carolina's been called yet. So, that's another close one. So, it looks like Biden should have won that. But yeah, see, that's one. Biden should have won that, according to the exit polling. But here they flipped it for Trump. But it's within the margin of error. And I think I read somewhere that Karl Rove has said, I think his thing was keep it within the margin of error, that 3%. Keep it. And then, if it's really close, but you just flip it enough. Yeah. So most of these states, the fraud was for Trump. Yeah, I think was it 22 of the 24, and then 12 of them were outside of the margin. So these are the ones outside of the margin of error. So the only one for Biden, wait a minute, is that right? Yeah, so I guess the only one for Biden here is California. Let's see, Washington State. That was fairly accurate, I think, there. Yeah. Anyway, California is a big one. That was called for Biden. So there was, yeah, Biden would have won California anyway, but I don't know. They really padded the vote there for him. Yeah, so Nevada is another one where they had a hard time calling. So it was Biden was well ahead in Nevada. 50, just a little over 50% compared to almost 44% for Trump. But here they made it really close. Biden is still leading in the official um, count, but the margin of error. So, they were trying to switch that to Trump. Arizona is another one that has been. Alex Jones was in Arizona trying to whip up the crowd, the Trump supporters. So that one clearly went, according to exit polls, to Biden. But they were flipping it for Trump, so it was close there in the official count. Um, Georgia, I think, was another one. So Georgia, Biden a little over 50%, Trump a little over 47%. Um, and they made it much closer there, much, much closer there, but it's within the margin of error. Um, yeah, so he's got in the asterisks. It says the states marked by an asterisk indicate states where the um, exit polling um, vote count discrepancies are probably much greater than shown. So that's interesting. He's highlighted Kentucky with an asterisk. Michigan was another one. Yeah, Michigan. So Michigan, Biden, clearly Biden. Oh man, by 10% in the exit polling. And then they made it much closer. Yeah, that was outside the margin of error. Um, yeah, Nevada. So Kentucky, Michigan, Nevada, Florida. That was very close in the exit polling. And oh yeah, so Florida is another one. So it was very close, but according to the exit polling, Biden should have won. Very close. And then, but they got it flipped here. They got Trump 51.24% and Biden just 47. So they took away, and they're third party candidates. They take some of the votes away from them too. I know that. So that one was outside of the margin of error. So that's another one that probably should not have gone to Trump. Um, yes, in Nevada, that's another one dodgy there. Texas, that's another one with the asterisk. So, yeah, Trump, 51% to Biden's 47.5%. And then Trump got a little bit more and Biden got a little bit less. So I don't know. So these aren't final, but this is as of Saturday. Very interesting stuff. I urge you to look at this chart. You can stop the video and look at this. It's very interesting. And people on Twitter, social media, they're just ignoring this chart. They're not, when I bring up exit polling, crickets. The one shares it seems to be Scott, maybe one or two others. That's it. But I will talk about the exit polling and what it shows and how they won't talk about electronic voting fraud. They won't talk about it, talk about voter fraud. With Trump, the funny thing is Trump, he's talking about fraud, that it was rigged. And some think there is the thinking that maybe that's when they decided, we're not going to rig it enough for you, Trump. I don't know. Could be. It's hard to say. Yeah, so these figures have kind of disappeared. The ones who were talking about electronic voting, election fraud, electronic voting fraud, voter suppression, and exit polling. So it's very hard to get this information out. It's hard to get people to talk about it. And the Trump supporters are really in denial when I bring this up. And I tell them, listen, I'm not a Biden supporter. I am not a Biden supporter. And I thought that Trump would win either by legitimately or by rigging. And they were trying to rig it for Trump. So that's what I thought, I thought Biden was a terrible candidate that, the Democrats are trying to lose, and they were trying to rig it but I guess the vote, they're trying to get the vote out. And Trump had been demonized for, so many ridiculous, you can legitimately criticize Trump for his policies, but the I guess it's black propaganda, all this bullshit about him connected being Putin's puppet and all this bullshit, that was working on people. So, they got the vote out. People were upset. The economy was bad. Economy was bad. No doubt about it. With this, the lockdowns, the coronavirus, this whole psyop, it's not, people are suffering, so they tend to take it out on the incumbent president. That's just reality. So, but Trump supporters are really in denial, and they blocked me when I point these things out. Um, I don't know. People just don't want to hear the truth. I just want to know the truth. I mean, I hate Biden, but Biden won. According to the exit polling, Biden won. You know, can't deny that. But the Trump supporters, like, they go on about voter fraud and the mail-in ballots. Well, the mail-in ballots, when once they process those in those optical scanners, they can flip that vote too. There's no trusting any of that. Anything to do with, so mail-in ballots are paper, but they're electronically scanned. And in that Hacking Democracy HBO documentary, it showed how they can flip the vote, no problem. But people don't want to hear this. They just don't want to hear it. And it's frustrating. I'm just trying to get this information out anyway. So figures have disappeared. Nobody wants us to talk about electronic voting fraud, exit polls, voter suppression. Yeah, real things. Not this voter fraud. Voter fraud, dead people voting. No, that's too hard. They, you know, yeah. So anyway, I guess that's it. I find this fascinating. This stuff about the exit polling is just fascinating to me. I don't know. Anyway, that's all I want to say for now. Thanks for your patience, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.